Good morning, good afternoon, and good night, depending on which time zone you are. I am Shervan Fashandi, a board member of Iranian American for Liberty. And I'm here to discuss a new topic of the day, which is the economic problems in Iran under the Islamic Republic and the role of foreign, especially US sanctions. So the dominant narrative is that all or most of the economic problems in Iran and all the economic hardship, the failure of the banking system and the social security system is mostly or completely rooted in foreign, especially US sanctions against the regime. And this dominant narrative is promoted over and over by the regime apologists in the West and their proxies, and mostly even sometimes in mainstream media, in Western mainstream media. And they even attribute the failure of the healthcare system or the educational system, they blamed on the US sanctions, even though food and import of food and medical supplies have never been subject to US sanctions, whether under President Obama or President Trump. So here, we are here in this webinar to examine validity of this claim and see whether the data and empirical evidence supports this claim or not. So to do so, we have two panelists, two distinguished panelists. We are honored to have them. Mr. Mohammad Reza Jahan Parvar, an economist, an Iranian born US-based economist in the East Coast. And from the other side of the country, Ms. Pooya Nasseri, another expert in finance and economics based in the West Coast in California. So I'm going to let Mr. Jahan Parvar make an introduction, introduce himself and elaborate a little bit about his background and education. And then we switch to Ms. Nasseri, and then we can take over with the questions. Dr. Jahan Parvar.
Thank you very much, Shervan. My name is Mohammad Jahan Parvar. I am an economist. I graduated from National University of Iran in 1997 and got my PhD in financial economics in 2007 from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Subsequently, I have been in American universities in academia and then US government at various levels since 2013. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Pooya?
Hi, I'm Pooya Nasseri. So I'm based in San Francisco, California for a couple of years now. And I also graduated, I'm not a trained economist. I graduated my bachelor's in civil engineering, and then later on I went to Germany. I got my MBA, and my focus was investment and foreign direct investment, where I worked also with a company, Germany Trade and Invest. We're doing consulting for foreign direct investors interested in investing in Germany, and there I got very familiar with the investment strategies and then how the foreign investors evaluate their strategy and risk assessment. I moved to US and I got my master in finance from Georgetown. And since then, I'm working also with different tech companies, mostly since I'm based in San Francisco, on financial analysis, investment strategy, risk assessment when it comes to their international portfolio. That's about me.
Great, thanks for the introduction. Very impressive backgrounds and diverse ones, especially with Pooya. Her background, she started with engineering and then switched to switched business and finance. Yeah, that's kind of a story of my life too. So let's start with the discussion. So the first one, let's start with Mohammad Reza. So Dr. Jahan Parvar, what are the root causes of the economic problems in Iran under the Islamic Republic? And we know that most of these problems go back to at least 4 decades. Iran under the Islamic Republic spent the first decade after the revolution, the 80s, mostly entangled and dragged down by the infamous Iran-Iraq war, which was a totally unnecessary war. It could have been avoided it could have been avoided easily. And then the 90s, there were some talk about economic recovery and progress, etc. And then since 2000, it's been basically dragged down by the entire crisis about the nuclear weapons, etc. And here we are after almost 40 years, more than 40 years. So just give us a brief review of the economic problems at the macroeconomic level, and then we can take it from there. And before you start, I would like to emphasize that both Pooya and Dr. Jahan Parvar collaborated beautifully, put together these slides, and so we'll have a visual presentation as well.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity again. So let's actually start with some macroeconomic history, and I hope that I'm not boring the esteemed viewers and audience with this. So let's actually go to, so let me see, yeah. Let's go to the history, kind of the recorded history of macroeconomic performance of Iran. So this data is from World Bank. Reliable data in Iran starts from roughly 1955. And what we notice at this point is, and I hope that you can trace my cursor here. This is the trajectory of growth of Iranian economy per person in constant US dollars. So inflation and population growth are controlled for. Between 1955 and 1975, roughly. So what you notice is that the country went from roughly $3,000 constant 2009 dollars to about $10,000, which is the threshold for rich country, kind of essentially upper middle income, almost rich country, between 1955 and 1975. The Iranian economy topped at about $10,000 in 1975, 76. And notice that the oil boom, the 70s oil boom, happened towards the very end of this period. So from 1955 to about 1973, 74, it was essentially driven by domestic demand and development in the country. Then the revolution happened in 77, 78, and 79, pretty much, particularly 78 and 79. And from 1980, Islamic Republic has been firmly in power for the subsequent 4 decades. So you immediately see that the income dropped. It dropped further during the Iran-Iraq war, which ended in 1988. Supposedly, 1990s were the period of economic growth and reconstruction. And then after that, you had a massive oil boom between 2002 and roughly 2011. And since then, we have been, the country has been under sanctions. You immediately notice that had we stopped everything in roughly 1975, so essentially nothing else had happened, no subsequent growth, Iranians would have been still far better off than they are today based on this figure. And some of it is that you say that, okay, in the early decade of the Islamic Republic, they had the war problem. But you notice that even during the period between 1990 and 2006-7, when the conflict about the nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and nuclear developments came to the fore, you still see that the growth does not match what Iran had before. And in a separate study published in 2016, and unfortunately still relevant, I actually showed that the country apparently cannot generate a similar growth even compared to its neighbors. We are going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. So to give you an idea that where the country stands, I have, Pooya and I have highlighted the share of Iran in international output in percent and the rank of the country, given its relatively large population, between 1990 and 2018. So you immediately notice that the country is a middling country, but with a relatively low share of global output, and the share in exports and imports have not changed much in over 2 decades, or almost 3 decades at this point. And the country essentially does not pull its weight in terms of international trade, while the economy is heavily dependent on sale of, for example, oil and other hydrocarbons, and imports of many manufactured and capital goods. It also is not a hotspot for attracting foreign direct investment. And this is actually where Pooya is going to elaborate some about that. What are the impediments for such developments? Essentially, why the country cannot attract investment and, by extension, foreign expertise to develop its economy. Pooya?
Yeah, that's a very great data we have seen here in comparison to 1990, and then how the countries has not made any progress in terms of like attracting the global investors, and also like what we have seen also recent the past 10 years, even the local capital is fleeing the country. The investment environment in Iran is not safe for the local investors, and is not safe for the foreign investors. The investors like evaluate their investment with two most important factors: return and the risk. If the risk is not if its risk is very high, or you cannot like assess the risk properly, which is the case of Iran. Iran has a very high geopolitical risk, which is coming from the regime's behavior in the international world and non-compliances with like all the rules and regulations when it comes to like nuclear program development, or just missiles. I want to actually like look back like where everything started when I'm talking about the nuclear program and the illegal activities that Iran started. It's going back to 2003 and 2004, when the international community actually realized that Iran is having this illegal activities around the nuclear program and development, and also like adjusting the Shahab 3 missiles to carry the nuclear weapon. That was the time when Khatami, the so-named reformist, was in office. He was the president, and it was exactly the time when the country actually has opened up a little bit, and the foreign investors and some of the companies, mostly like a resource-seeking companies, because they're normally the first that get into the countries like Iran, like a Total has invested in Iran, and we were seeing some partnership between French automakers like Renault, Peugeot, and some other companies from South Korea and so on. But then at the same time, we're seeing that Iran started this nuclear program, and in 2005, and Europe really tried to make some agreement with Iran, so they stopped their enrichment and they stopped all this like illegal activities. But at some point in 2005, Iran said like, yeah, no, we are not complying with anything. And then the economy like started, and all the foreign investors that had like started to trust the country and enter to the country just closed down their businesses and started like getting out of the country. And that's the case so far. The investors need safe and the reliable politics to stay in the country, to invest long term, to invest in the long term projects that has a long term return of investment and is capital intensive. Other than that, when the environment is not right, the investors will not stay, and they will not enter to countries, and they will not also go to any partnership with the local businesses. We're seeing like that's another case of FATF after JCPOA has been signed. by Iran, we're seeing that like the financial institutions and the foreign businesses, like international businesses, they were not interested into like any sort of partnership with Iran. They didn't want to like have any businesses with Iran, despite the European Union, especially like ordering, or also at that point, the Obama administration were mentioning that Iran, it's safe to have business with Iran. It's safe to like start like partnershiping with Iran. Safe to like have opening this relationship with Iran. But we are seeing that the financial institution and also businesses, they were not interested because they could see the risk, and they could also not assess properly the risk of entering into business with Iran because of the previous behaviors that Iran, like the regime, had in the past 4 decades, and also not complying with with international financial regulations. That here is like FATF. We're seeing Iran is not complying, they're not ratifying. For 12 years, they're playing with going back and forth with FATF. And at the end of the day, they went to the blacklist. So this is a country that has a very high geopolitical risk, and it's not attractive to local investors, and not even to foreign, and not also to foreign investors, not even to resource-seeking investors.
So let me actually add something on Pooya's observation. So while she correctly pointed out the 2003 breakout of the nuclear activities dilemma, there was an earlier episode. So if you remember, during 1990s, Iranian economy opened up. Many of us are too young to remember that, but I do. So the country opened up, and there was a period that actually many foreign investors tried to invest in the country. Then there was the terrorist attack on Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, and actually at some point stopped the development of the foreign partnerships with the country under Rafsanjani's period. That was supposed to be the period of reconstruction. Then after that came the Mykonos event, where Iranian dissidents were murdered by the agents of the Islamic Republic in Berlin, in Europe. And that also put another monkey wrench into the economic relationships that the country had with the West. So if you want to think about it, at this stage, we can say that this is not a bug in the system. This is the system. So essentially, the economic development is subordinate to the policies of the Islamic Republic, which are actually at odds with international norms. So it is, to some extent, naive to say that by engaging the government, it is going to change its behavior, because it has repeatedly shown that it won't. So at this point, you are seeing from 1995, 2003, 2005, 2010, after the entanglement of Iran in the Syrian debacle, and then later in Yemen, and for example, attacks in Argentina, in Thailand, all over Europe, and in Turkey, northern Iraq, so on and so forth. You see that this is the behavior of the government. This is how they act. There is no evidence in 4 decades that they are going to change their behavior. Now, does it have a cost? Absolutely it does. Let's actually take a look. So this is a picture that essentially says in year 2000, Iran, Middle East on average, and the world pretty much had an average income, per capita income, of about $5,000 per person. 20 years later, the world and the Middle East have doubled their share. It's about 10,000. These are not controlled for inflation and population growth. These are current prices per person. But for Iran, you have moved to roughly about 7,000. So there is a gap. That gap has widened, and essentially shows that in 20 years, the country has not moved much. It has ramifications. There are costs here. You cannot say that all of this was due to sanctions, because for the early part of the sample that you're looking at, there were no sanctions. Moreover, if you want to make a comparison with the neighbors, which is Middle Eastern countries, these are in so-called purchasing power parity. To kind of explain what I mean by that, take the case for example, fuel prices in Iran. Fuel prices are heavily subsidized, as are, for example, price of certain items, food items in the country. Some of the neighboring countries do not have this level of support for these same items. Once you control for the level of subsidies paid to the residents, once you control for differences in taxation, tax burden, different government interventions, so on and so forth, you get a measure that essentially gives you the idea that how much a dollar really buys in the countries. Now, you notice that Iran had a gap starting in 1985 during the war with its neighboring countries. This gap was more or less stable, but since 2010, about 10 years ago, it has widened, and it has kept on widening. Now, what does it mean? So think about this. Once you have these differences in comparisons with the world and with the neighbors, you essentially get to the point that Iran, at the very beginning of this sample in 1977, 78, was almost about to reach the level of income that you see in Western Europe, specifically Spain, and one of its richest neighbors, Israel. At this stage, we are comparable to the average of Middle East that includes everything from United Arab Emirates on one side to Egypt on the other side. Now you are below the average for the Middle East, that again, is not a hotspot of growth in the world. By falling back, even in comparison with neighbors, now Iran is getting, and given that the rest of the world is growing much faster than Iran, you have gone from getting a comparison with Spain in 1977 to being about to be surpassed by India right now. And for a country like Iran that actually was growing fast or has the potential which is not realized in 4 decades, this is a very important issue. Think about it, that given that there has been no growth in the country for 20 years, the public health is not funded. The social safety net, essentially the equivalent of social security in Iran, the retirement accounts are not funded, and you're seeing the effects. The security of the country, given that you cannot update for example, the weaponry systems that the police or the army have, is way behind other countries, and it is not funded. Think about the educational system, incentives for people to better their human capital, and then essentially also the issue of human capital and physical capital itself. Now, part of it is due to sanctions, but sanctions, as you saw, do not seem to be the driving force behind the Iranian economy's problems. They're actually rather a reflection of the fact that Iran is isolated from the rest of the world. And that isolation is more or less due to the behavior of the government. Now, add to that the inability of the government to implement policies like correct monetary policies to control inflation. Now, this is a comparison between inflation in Iran, the blue line, Middle East region in orange, and the rest of the world. Now you see that from 1995 to pretty much the beginning of this year, inflation in Iran is higher than both the region and the rest of the world by a large clip. Now, going back to what Pooya was mentioning, this level of fluctuations in inflation actually have a huge impact on risk analysis for any country, any company that wants to enter the Iranian market and make long-term investments. And it also have a huge impact on long-term investment of Iranian residents. So if you cannot bet on stability of prices, some level of macroeconomic stability within the country, you do not invest long-term. And you see that in the investment profile of the country. Now, just to let you know, controlling inflation is not rocket science anymore. Actually, the reverse is true. High inflation is not a problem. Most countries nowadays are struggling with too low inflation, that the prices are very low, and there is a gap between the targets announced by central banks and actually the realized inflations within the countries, largely because technological progress have made goods and services actually less costly as time goes by. Now, with this, I want to take you to another very alarming issue that has developed within Iran, and I believe that it's going to have very long-term ramifications for years to come. And that's the issue of formation of capital. Pooya mentioned that both Iranian investors do not invest and foreign investors are unwilling to invest in Iran. The data that you see is changes in capital stock after depreciation based on the data from Central Bank of Iran, starting in 2006 and ending more recently. Now, one thing you immediately see, starting in 2009, the growth rate of capital has started going down, and last year it turned negative. Essentially, it means not only you're not replacing your existing capital, you're consuming, you're eating into the capital stock that you had, which essentially is the combination of, let's say, that roads built, factories in place, softwares implemented, the technology transferred, and the knowledge base within the economy. So I'm considering both the physical and the intangible capital put together. A developing country like Iran typically actually has high net capital growth rate. The behavior that you see, particularly from 2009 onwards, is unusual. So the 4% growth that you see was not high to begin with. And the fact that it has turned negative is actually alarming, because moving forward, it means that the productivity of Iranian workers, which was never high to begin with, is going to actually drop because they have less capital to work with. And the capital is getting old. Essentially, it is the gap between Iran and the rest of the world, even the region, is expanding. JCPOA did not affect that. So, one may turn around and say that from 2011 afterwards, you were under sanctions. JCPOA went into effect. There is no change. And actually, the capital growth even fell further during this period. Again, this doesn't seem to be due to sanctions. This seems to be due to both geopolitical risk, macroeconomic risk, and the financial risk embedded in the system. It is the system. It is not the sanctions from where I sit right now. Do you have any, Pooya, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, I just wanted to add some points, as Dr. Jahan Parvar was saying, this is the system. It's when we look at also other indicators, how's the corruption in Iran? These are all the factors that the investors take into the consideration when they go for the investments. And investment is the most important factor to go from there for employment stability, and also knowledge improvement between the employees, and also a long-term stability of the economy. So investment is the key. If the investment environment is not right, the investment will not happen. The long-term investment will not happen. And then we are seeing the economy is weakening and weakening down the road. for instance, like looking at the corruption in Iran in the past 10 years, in 2010, the corruption rank, Iran ranked 120 in the world in terms of corruption, and 2020, Iran ranked 149. It dropped 29 points or 29 ranks down. This is not due to the sanctions. This has nothing to do with the foreign countries or their policies on Iran. This is the inside system and the corruption, and the economy is also like very highly monopolized by government and governmental entities and the regime entities. Like a Revolutionary Guard has a huge role in the economy. The economy, 80% of the economy is in the hand of like a semi-governmental, governmental, or just Revolutionary Guards organization. So this economy is not even competitive. It's corrupt, it's not competitive. They are engaged in the systematic like corruption, money laundering, and also financing the terrorism. This is like a disaster for the investors. This is a disastrous environment for the investors. Investment is not happening. Then we are seeing like the GDP per capita is dropping, the employment and the labor participation is a disaster in Iran. And it's like the economy is like weakening and weakening. And there, as Dr. Jahan Parvar said, it has nothing to do with the sanctions or so on. It is the performance of the Iranian regime.
So on that note, I want to actually take it forward, because here we are talking about physical capital. Now, more important than physical capital is the issue of human capital. Let's see where we stand here. There are warning signs that things are slipping on the human capital dimension. Now, generally, when Iranians sit next to each other or sit with each other or talk to foreigners, they talk about that the country is young, educated, and ready for investment. That story was true about a decade ago. Several things have changed. Iran had its, so the use of the labor force was actually something which was a construct from the population growth that happened in 70s, 80s, and started dying out in 1990s. Actually, one of the most successful programs of the Islamic Republic policy has been the population control, which was necessary and still is. However, it also masks an issue that the children that were born in 1980s actually are in labor force. They have been looking for jobs that never materialized due to that drop in investment that you saw, and successive sanctions, economic uncertainty, foreign policy that actually caused a lot of geopolitical tensions, and essentially the country getting cut out from the rest of the world. Now, more recently, we are seeing that the generation that's supposed to actually support these older generation, if you will, who will start retiring within 10 to 20 years from now, these are the children who are now at school. Based on the TIMSS results, which is an international test for participating countries that looks at science and mathematics performance of 4th graders and 8th graders, you actually realize that Iran is slipping, and is slipping fast, both internationally and within the region. So I'm looking, so in this figure, you are looking at the ranking of Iran with some neighboring countries in 4th grade science education. Now you see that the top of the line, Turkey, if you consider Cyprus to be a Middle Eastern country, it really is not, but it is within the region. Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Armenia, and even Georgia are doing much better. Now, if we consider 8th grade, you realize that, okay, kind of Israel, Turkey, Bahrain against Cyprus, Qatar, United Arab Emirates are doing a lot better. And performance of Iran is barely better than Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, that traditionally didn't do too well, but notice that a lot of neighbors in Persian Gulf region are doing much better in science education. The same story about mathematics. 4th grade, Iran is not on the top of the list within the region at 4th grade, and at 8th grade, still the same. Now, a couple of really disturbing things actually appeared once this test was taken. Remember, Iran's performance is overshadowed, or essentially is masked by the performance of students who leave the country from one of the elite universities and do well in international corporations or academic environments. Your workforce are not necessarily University of Tehran or Sharif graduates. Your workforce typically is somebody who graduates from high school, not necessarily from one of the big cities, and is supposed to be an industrial worker or a service worker. In that sense, you see that Iran is not doing well, and it is slipping. Other countries are overtaking it fast. So the students who were subject to these tests, a good number of them came and said that they have to work, they go to bed late because they have to help their families, and they go to bed hungry, not necessarily because hunger is pervasive, because they do not get enough nutrients. Now, this is a function of a badly managed economy. This is the function of that inflation. This is the outcome of successive periods of isolation from the rest of the world, no transfer of capital, no transfer of technology, and no growth. So when Islamic Republic leaders come and say that we can endure sanctions and it doesn't do anything to us, this is what it does to the country. And this is what is masked by the fact that the true cost of this isolation and this aggressive foreign policy, bad relationship with neighbors and the rest of the world is not shown. Now, I want to take this to next stage, which is Pooya's expertise, and it is labor force participation. Pooya?
Yeah, thank you. So I don't know if my voice is right.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. So yeah, when we are looking at well, as you said, like for instance, like the knowledge and skills that that people like develop during their career, they need to be hired in the first place after the graduation of schools, or just like even like high school, go to the workforce, and then if the employers are the right businesses and the good businesses and good investment that happen in the country, either they're like a local investors and the businesses and industries, or the foreign one, they can train people. They can train people further, so they will improve their skills. They can learn from the employers, and then further on, like have better knowledge and improve their knowledge. That would basically improve the employees and the labor force skills. So like let's look at like just we know that the unemployment rate is very high in Iran, is over 24%. But like when we talk about the unemployment rate 24%, we are not having the entire picture. Let's look at the labor force participation. We're not talking about labor force participation being over 70-75%, and the like unemployment rate being high in like 24%. You're talking about labor force participation in Iran being around 45%, which is very low compared to Middle East, which is very low. Even looking at the chart, we can see like Afghanistan, Middle East in average, Turkey and Saudi Arabia are doing much better than Iran in terms of like employing people. When people are not getting employed, when they're not participating in the labor force, the economy of the families, the economy of the country is basically just like getting devastated. The GDP per capita is coming down. There is no wealth generating wealth in the families and by the people, and that has like and then the further it goes, like the longer it goes, the worse it gets, because then you have like an older aged people that they did not have the opportunity to gain any skills and knowledge working for the different industries and different businesses, and then they're just like getting to the retirement age. So this is a disastrous like chart you're seeing here, and that's because there is no investment. There is no investment. There is no long-term investment. There is no industries. There is no like a right industries and the businesses to employ people and then help people during the career, and then just like increase their skills and knowledge. So
let me actually take it to the next one, which is we are not even catching up with the neighbors.
Exactly. So we are not catching up with the neighbors, and we are not making any progress. Going back again to your point, saying this regime, this is how they function. This is their operating system. Our problems are within the country. It's not the outside. So we are looking at the chart from 1990 to 2020. The labor participation didn't change at all. So it totally shows while the Middle East average is going up, the Iran's like didn't change. It's around 47%. Now it's around like the same rate. So so it means like there is no plan in place. There were no management in place. There is no emphasis and focus on like improving the situation. No one is even looking into it. No one planning for it. And that's caused like, yeah.
I wanted to, kind of, as you pointed out, there is nothing in place, and it's a particularly raw deal for women. And here's the figure.
Yeah, that's right. It's even worse. Like even when we're looking at the labor participation in total, Iran, I think, ranked in the last slide. I think I had it like Iran were ranked 12 from in the world, 12 from the last, 12 from the bottom, which is very like similar to the countries at war, like Yemen, Syria, and we're seeing this rank to be more in the same page with those countries. When it comes to women labor participation, it's even worse. We are in the rank 6 from the bottom of the world. So it's even worse. At one side, they're saying like, yeah, women participation at universities and graduate schools is like the rate is 60% of the students are women. But when we're going to the labor participation and women getting employed, we're not seeing any progress here. And we can see that Saudi Arabia is doing much better than Iran in terms of like labor participation. And also the Middle East, Afghanistan is doing better than Iran. Turkey is like way ahead of like Middle Eastern countries. And as we can see, no progress made either. So we know like all the rules and regulations are not supporting women, and in general, the environment, like investment environment, and all of that is not supporting the labor and employees and people like looking for employment.
So this is actually, I think it was a very sobering set of statistics that Pooya put together here, because it is one thing to talk about unemployment, which is people who are looking for a job, but they can't find one. The other one is the labor participation, which is the idea of that, what is the size of your workforce and what percentage of this workforce, people who can work, are actually engaged in gainful employment. And it becomes particularly grim when you look at the official participation rate for women. As Pooya pointed out, there is a massive amount of resources spent on educating women who later on actually do not enter the workforce. And so what does it mean? It means that you spend money and then essentially do not use the resources that you have. And as Pooya again correctly pointed out, if you do not match your education, whether at high school or at college or at technical schools, with real world experience, as all of us know, that knowledge goes stale. And within 5 years, essentially nobody cares what you took in university if you have not worked and gained new knowledge. And as you realize that generations of Iranians have entered the job market, have stayed on long-term unemployment, and then generally have found jobs that are not necessarily good matches for what they have learned, it essentially means that the incentive for investing in human capital, personal betterment, if you will, have been low. And it has long-term ramifications, sometimes for a generation or more, but what you can do and how quickly you can turn things around. Now, again, what we want to say is that, do these problems stem from sanctions, international or the US? I don't think so, because you see that during the periods that there were no sanctions in place or they were not as stringent, you still saw an inability in the system to generate growth, attract technology transfer, or integrate the country in the rest of the world. Now, the period was not a bad period. So if you want to go back in history, there were two periods of globalization. One was from roughly the end of from 1870 until 1914. And the other one started actually pretty much at the same time as the Iranian Revolution, from 1980 until some people say 2020. During both periods, the Qajar government in 19th century and the Islamic Republic in 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century almost made sure that Iran is left out of this process of global synchronized growth. Let's put it this way, we missed that opportunity. These sanctions are the result of this deliberate policies. They are not the cause of the stagnation that you see. So they imposed the cause, but they were not the root cause. They imposed the cost on the country, but they were never the root cause. Some colleagues here in DC actually have a term that they say that the economic policies of the Islamic Republic are essentially consuming the country. The economic policies of the United States vis-a-vis Iran are controlling the cost that Iran actually imposes on the rest of the neighbors and the world. I find that characterization that the Islamic Republic is consuming the country to be apt. It's a good characterization. As you saw in the growth of the human capital and the growth of the physical capital in the country, at the point that people have no incentive to better themselves, and they are quite happy not to invest and use up what's already in place, you are consuming the country. And we have not even started talking about the environmental problems that mismanagement for many, many years have imposed on vast areas within the country, and it's a ticking bomb moving forward.
Okay. So to summarize and recap, thank you both Pooya and Mohammad for the impressive overview and analysis of the economic problems in Iran, and basically showing with empirical evidence that many issues that we see hindering the foreign investment, for instance, not complying with the international regulations and financing terrorism, laundering money, etc., are basically the features of the Islamic Republic, not the bugs in the system. And the whole point is set up to achieve these negative goals, if you will. And nothing can manifest it further than the stats that Pooya presented on women's participation. Remember, back in the 60s, there was this huge promotion of women's rights, women participation in the workforce under the Pahlavi, during the Pahlavi era. And how did Ayatollah Khomeini start his movement, if you will, his reactionary movement? It was a backlash, a reaction to women's progress and women's participation. And there is no surprise that the regime that he founded has achieved the objective, the stated objective. The entire movement was started to stop women from voting, from the right to have the vote, to vote, and the right to be elected and participate in the labor force. And voila, here we are after almost 50s, 60s years after Ayatollah Khomeini started his movement. And originally he was pushed back, the movement was pushed back and controlled by the Shah's security services. And finally they succeeded and they achieved what they had stated. So they in a sense, they delivered what they promised. But what they promised was evil. So also, I would like to touch on another issue. And Pooya, it would be great if you can elaborate on that. So you guys basically listed a whole bunch of reasons why the foreign investors are hesitant to make long-term investments in Iran, even if the sanctions are not taken into account. One issue I think is missed, and that is lack of an independent judiciary. What do I mean by that? Any investment is based on a contract, some sort of contract, which lists the rights and obligations of the investors, and so on and so forth, and bunch of conditions and covenants. And what is the implicit assumption behind that? The implicit assumption behind any contract is that if there is a dispute, if one side, one party to the contract, one obligor does not comply with their obligations, then the other party can take them to a court, and there's a due process, there's an independent judiciary that will rule in the favor of whoever is wrong. That's the implicit basis, the implicit assumption in any investment. Now, and as you see, major investors, as you know, major investors have experts, lawyers. They try to get clever on how to draft the contract and so on and so forth. Now, imagine in an environment where there is no there is no independent judiciary system. What is the point of even writing a contract? Because every single contract effectively would be rendered useless, null and void. And just imagine, like, talk to any average Iranian, whether business savvy or normal people. Imagine if a foreign investor or a local investor makes a joint investment with an IRGC affiliated borrower or an IRGC affiliated party. And for some reason, there's a dispute. And you take the IRGC affiliated entity to the court. If you dream or suggest that the court will take your side, you'd be laughed out of the room in any environment, in any society, like that Iranians in any gathering that Iranians are sitting next to each other. So that's just one example. Pooya, if you would like to touch on that point.
No, that's a great point. That's very important when the investors, like, it doesn't matter if they're also sophisticated local investors or they're foreign investors, they both like assess the risk, looking also into independent judiciary system and the modern rules and regulations around businesses, which we do not have it. Even for the a resource seeking investors, they're like a basic and the most like a they have the highest risk tolerance because they're after natural resources. This is very important because, as you mentioned, like they go to the court and then there is a bias, and you're like dealing with the economy and the businesses that 80% of the economy is in the hand of like a Revolutionary Guard and also government and the other governmental related organizations. So, and the judiciary system is biased, and they're gonna like support them over you as an independent private investors, or you should bribe them, which is a crime in the financial regulation and system. So if you're like a reputable, like a foreign international company, you cannot bribe anyone. You cannot bribe any organization. You cannot engage in those type of like financial activities, criminal financial activities, and so on. And I also, like, I know we don't have that much time, but I also want to like look a little bit back to like what Iranian regime wants when they're talking about lifting the sanctions. They mentioned that all they want is selling the oil. Okay, first of all, let's look at like the future of this selling the oil. First of all, like Iran's economy is not being like improved radically by just selling the oil. When we look at the GDP in 2012, just 60% of the GDP is coming from oil. So Iran needs a diverse economy. Iran needs investment, local and foreign investments, to be able to improve the GDP and increase it. And then when we are looking also in the global demand in the oil in 2030, the global demand will be the same as 2019. It's 100 million barrel per day. When we're going further, in 2050, the global oil demand will drop to 84 million barrels per day. So this shows like there is no like a good future in oil. That's why all the oil economies like Saudi Arabia are diversifying their economy further away from oil to have other industries in place. And if also you look at the Iran's share market in the oil, you see like Iran was ranked 6th at some point in the oil export. Now Iran's rank is 21 in the oil export. So we lost the market share, and gaining this market share is basically like very, very unlikely to the extent that it was, and very impossible. United States just increased their production since 2015 to today by 640%. They're not depending on anyone's oil, like for instance, and they're also like getting to the point of like exporting. So Iran's like doesn't have the market share. Where once you lose your market share, it's also happened to other industries like carpet, Persian carpet, or saffron, or other products that we had like specifically from Iran. We lost our market share, and it's very hard to regain it.
Yeah, exactly. Very good points. And thanks for the elaboration, both on the market, on Iran losing the market share in oil, and also lack of independent judiciary. I mean, there's no way to sugarcoat it, but I think it's more rational to make investment with the Sicilian mafia than with the regime, because you may get a better deal, a more fair deal from the Sicilian mafia, to be fair. So that's where we are, and this is important. Lack of independent judiciary has nothing to do with the U.S. sanctions or other foreign sanctions on the regime. No sanction is stopping the regime from building a respectable, even half-decent judiciary system. It's their doing. So there's no way anybody, any of the regime apologists can blame that on the sanctions. The very last question we have we are almost out of time. We can extend by 5 minutes. The very last question from Dr. Jahan Parvar. How feasible or practical is it for the Biden administration to lift all or most of the U.S. sanctions against the Islamic Republic regime? we know that some of the sanctions go back longer, way before the Trump administration. Some of them are more recent. And based on your experience, please elaborate how likely that is.
So there are two sets, this is a great question. There are three sets of sanctions in place against Iran. So some of them were the United Nations sanctions. Some of them are sanctions that are applied at the supranational level, so let's say European Union, and some are sanctions that are applied at national level. In case of United States, there are, again, two sets of sanctions at national level imposed against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Some of them are by executive order of the president. So essentially, the president decides that such and such entity, government institution, or industry is going to be sanctioned. The other ones are imposed at the level of the Congress. So essentially, there has been a law, it has gone to the Congress, and Congress has imposed a sanction on the country. Now, the executive orders can be reversed by the order of the president. If anything has gone to Congress and it has been imposed with congressional approval, it requires an act of Congress and a direct order to the Department of the Treasury to reverse those sanctions. Those cannot be done unless there is bipartisan agreement on reversing those particular acts. So let's say that there is complete agreement on removing the sanctions imposed against Iran by the United States government. If you are supposed to just queue these reversals, congressional reversals, it takes over 2 years, because in between you have to think about the domestic policy, other foreign policy issues, and United States budget, and other miscellaneous items that actually are referred to the Congress. So what I'm trying to say is that President Biden can reverse executive orders, but reversing the more profound, more targeted, more important sanctions imposed by the Treasury under the direction of the Congress and the whole United States government, those are going to be a far more daunting task. It takes a lot longer.
That's a very good point. Dr. Jahan Parvar. So Pooya, any last minute comments before we close the roundtable, the webinar?
No, first of all, thank you so much again for inviting me. It was also very educational for me, the seminar, and I think we covered all the points, and the summary is like the Islamic regime is a mafia system, which is not, you cannot have any healthy economy and in any future for the country under this regime, basically, because we have seen that they have a long history of like breaking rules and regulations, being non-compliant, having all sort of like criminal activities and terrorism activities in the region, and the economy is not gonna survive under this management. And it's not gonna improve even with lifting the sanctions.
Okay, that's a very accurate, but at the same time depressing summary conclusion. And to me, it seems that based on the evidence and data that was presented today, and in many other places, Iran under the Islamic Republic is basically doomed to turn into a failed state, which definitely will have ramifications for the security of the Middle East and worldwide security. And the only solution I see is for the world, for the responsible government, for the international community, to help the Iranian people in their aspirations against the regime, to basically get rid of the regime and replace it with a responsible government which puts forward the happiness and progress of the Iranian people, prosperity of the Iranian people, as opposed to financing terrorism or spreading its propaganda worldwide, etc. So, Dr. Jahan Parvar, would you like to close your arguments based on this point? Like, is Iran heading towards becoming the next failed state under the Islamic Republic? And is there any other solution for that major problem?
Thank you very much. Yes, I completely agree with you. I have to say that the Islamic Republic has been very honest about this point. Mr. Mesbahi Yazdi in 2014 expressly expressed that if a better economy was our goal, we would have been better off without the revolution. And Mr. Avini from the other side of this argument had said that if we wanted to become rich, we would have been as rich as Japan. This is not what we want. The issue is that Islamic Republic does not prioritize the welfare of Iranians. Now, if Iranians want to be better off, there is only one way forward. They need to get rid of the Islamic Republic system, because the system has shown that A, it is unwilling to change, B, it is unwilling to prioritize the citizens of Iran, and C, it is unwilling to engage with the rest of the world. The priority is, as you correctly pointed out, is to export the revolution, to export the hegemony of the Islamic Republic ideology. And Iran is essentially a cash cow for that. The cash cow is supposed to produce the resources that you need to extend the revolution. In that sense, the proxies in Yemen, Lebanon, or Syria are far more important and at higher priority than the unemployed young men in Fars or the oppressed women in other parts of the country, or the people who had to restore to selling gas or gasoline in black market in Baluchistan, because they are not directly furthering the ideological goals of the government. And moreover, the government has shown that it trusts its proxies more than the people in Iran, as we all saw in 2019. Now, sanctions impose a cost on the government, but not necessarily is a hindrance for them to extract resources from the people. If Iranians care, if they really want to be better off in the future, there is one way forward. This government needs to go.
Thank you. Thank you. And on that point, I have had this conversation with many Americans, many non-Iranians, Americans, Canadians, Europeans, and I've heard from them over and over, why would the world have to basically help the people of Iran, or take the risk to help the people of Iran, or pay any indirect cost? And my answer has always been, because this, if Iran fails into a failed state under the Islamic Republic, which seems to be guaranteed with this rate, can be extrapolated, it will cause a quagmire for the entire international community. You can't, no superpower or even no ordinary member of the international community can isolate themselves from the ramifications, whether it is the nuclear program or the missile program or economic crisis and the next failed state, the next Syria, the next Yemen, etc., etc. So we are all of us, we are all in this together, whether Iranian or non-Iranian, and we have a moral duty for the sake of ourselves, for the sake of our children, to help the people of Iran. On that note, I would like to close the webinar and thank the participants and the panelists for attending this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.